The silence of the Moretti estate was not a lack of sound, it was a heavy, suffocating blanket that smelled of expensive floor wax and ancient secrets. It was a silence that carried the weight of 100 years of dark history, pressing against Imani's chest until every breath felt like a trespass. In her small apartment across town, the night was filled with the honest noise of sirens and neighbors, but here, in the sprawling shadows of the primary wing, the quiet was a weapon, a cold velvet hand clapped over the mouth of the world. Every corner of the hallway was swallowed in shadow, save for the single, amber glow spilling from Catherine Moretti's bedroom. Inside, the air was different. It didn't smell of old money, it smelled of lavender, medicine, and the fading warmth of a life flickering out. Imani's hands, small and dark against the pale, translucent skin of the woman in the bed, were the only vibrant things in the room. She moved with a slow, aching tenderness, adjusting the silk sheets for the third time that hour. Exhaustion was no longer a feeling, it was a physical weight, a leaden hum in her bones after 18 hours of service. But in this house, the word no did not exist for people like her. You didn't decline the Morettis. You simply endured. Then, the silence broke. It started as a hum, low, honey-thick, and soulful. Imani didn't even realize she was doing it at first, letting an old lullaby her grandmother used to sing leak into the room. It was a soft, rhythmic prayer in a house that had forgotten how to pray. She focused on the frail hand in hers, letting her mind drift away from the marble floors and the men with guns at the gates. Thinking was a danger here. It was better to be a shadow, a ghost that provided comfort and then vanished. He was a man who lived in the roar of violence. Alessandro Moretti couldn't sleep, the echoes of the night's negotiation were still fresh, the metallic tang of blood still clinging to the back of his throat. He was a king who commanded an empire built on fear, yet he found no rest in the fortress he called home. He moved through the darkened halls like a panther, his feet silent on the cold stone. He had intended only to check on his mother, a nightly ritual of guilt and duty, but as he neared her door, a sound he hadn't heard in decades pulled him to a halt. He stopped in the archway, a silhouette carved from the darkness. He saw her there, the girl, Imani. He had seen her a dozen times carrying trays or scrubbing silver, but he had never truly seen her until this moment. The lamplight framed her profile like a holy icon, her face soft with a compassion that shouldn't exist in his world. Her voice was a gentle, hypnotic thread in the dark, weaving around his mother's frail form. She was performing a task of pure, unrewarded mercy, an insignificant detail in the brutal, bloody tapestry of his life as the city's most feared boss. Yet he stood there, paralyzed for 1 minute, then 5. He watched the way her thumb traced a soothing circle on his mother's knuckles, the way her eyes clouded with genuine emotion for a woman who was supposed to be nothing to her. In his world, everyone wanted something, they were terrified, greedy, or hollow. She was none of those things. She was simply there, existing in a bubble of warmth and melody. And for reasons he couldn't begin to name, the sight of her was the first moment of peace his soul had known since he was a child. The air in the room suddenly grew dense, electrified. Imani felt the prickle of heat on the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of a predator's gaze. The melody died in her throat, leaving the room twice as quiet as before. Slowly, her heart thudding like a trapped bird against her ribs, she turned. He was there. A towering shadow against the hall's deeper black. His hand was still resting on the heavy signet ring on his pinky, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink of his heritage. Even in the dim light, his presence was absolute, a gravitational force that seemed to pull the very air from her lungs. Imani didn't scream, she had perfected the art of the impassive mask. She simply bowed her head, her voice a mere whisper. Mr. Moretti. Alessandro Moretti did not walk through his halls, he haunted them. As he retreated from the doorway of his mother's room, the echo of Imani's song followed him like a ghost, a dissonant chord against the cold symphony of his life. He retreated to his study, a room designed to intimidate, filled with heavy mahogany and the scent of expensive leather and stale gunpowder. Here, the walls were lined with books he never read and maps of territories he had bled to conquer. He sat behind a desk of black obsidian, a surface as dark and unyielding as his own reputation. In the city below, the name Moretti was a curse whispered in the shadows of back alleys and the marble halls of the capital. He was the man who had ordered the purge of the Valenti line without blinking, the man who had turned the docks into a graveyard to prove a point about loyalty. To the world, he was a monster of efficiency, a king whose crown was forged from the iron of his own heart. But in the oppressive stillness of the mansion, the crown felt like a leaden weight. Alessandro looked at his hands, steady and scarred, and realized he couldn't remember the last time they had touched something without the intent to control or destroy it. His world was one of high-definition cruelty, crisp, sharp, and utterly devoid of color. He moved through a landscape of strategic alliances and calculated betrayals, where a smile was merely a precursor to a blade and a handshake was a test of grip. His mother's illness had been the only thing he couldn't kill or bribe into submission. It was a slow, rotting silence that had taken over the house, turning his sanctuary into a mausoleum. He had hired the best doctors and the most expensive nurses, yet they all moved through the estate with the same obsequious terror, their eyes never meeting his, their voices trembling with the effort of being invisible. They treated Catherine like a clinical failure, a problem to be managed. Then there was the girl. Imani. She was an anomaly in his sterile empire. He remembered the file he had skimmed when she was hired. Imani Brooks, no criminal record, exceptional references, a girl from a world where people worked for bread, not power. He had dismissed her as background noise, another pair of hands to keep the machine running. But the melody he had just heard was a crack in his obsidian walls. It wasn't the practiced efficiency of a nurse, it was the raw, unpolished sound of a soul. He reached for a crystal decanter, the amber liquid catching the moonlight. He was the scariest man in the city, a man who possessed everything and yet owned nothing that breathed. As he took a slow, burning sip, the silence of the study felt louder than it ever had before. For the first time in a decade, the heartless king felt the hollow space in his chest, and it throbbed with the rhythm of a song he didn't want to forget. The velvet shadows of the Moretti estate held their breath as Imani retreated from the doorway, the echo of Alessandro's heavy footsteps fading into the marble depths of the hall. She turned back to the bed, her heart still a frantic percussion against her ribs. In the dim, amber glow of the bedside lamp, Catherine looked like a piece of fine, cracked parchment, beautiful but terrifyingly fragile. To the rest of the world, Catherine J. Thompson was a living ghost, a relic of a legacy that had long since been bathed in blood, but to Imani, she was the only reason this house of iron hadn't turned her own heart into stone. Imani dipped a cloth into a basin of rose-scented water, the steam rising like a ghostly veil between them. She worked with a slow, rhythmic grace, wiping the fever sweat from the older woman's brow. This was her ritual, her secret rebellion against the cold sterility of the mansion. While the other maids hurried through their chores with downcast eyes and trembling hands, Imani allowed herself to linger. She saw the way Catherine's eyes searched the corners of the room for a son who only visited out of duty, and she felt a surge of protective heat that had no business existing in a servant's chest. He was here, wasn't he? Catherine's voice was a dry rasp, a sound like autumn leaves skittering across a grave. Imani paused, the damp cloth suspended in the air. She didn't need to ask who. The air in the room still felt heavy, charged with the lingering electricity of Alessandro's presence. He was, Imani whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilator. He stood in the shadows. He always stays in the shadows, Catherine sighed, a small, sad smile ghosting her lips. He thinks the dark can hide what he's become. But you bring the light in with you, Imani. It's a dangerous thing to carry in a house like this. Imani didn't answer. She couldn't. She was becoming increasingly aware of the boss's shadow everywhere she went. It wasn't just the way the guards stiffened when she passed, or the way the head housekeeper, a woman with eyes like flint, watched her with newfound suspicion. It was a physical sensation, a weight between her shoulder blades whenever she crossed the gardens, a shift in the air when she entered the kitchens. She was the only soft thing in a world made of jagged edges. As she tucked the silk sheets around Catherine's frail frame, Imani realized that she was no longer invisible. The predatory gaze she had felt in the doorway hadn't been one of malice, but of a terrifying, silent recognition. Alessandro Moretti hadn't just seen her, he had truly looked at her. And in this house, once the eagle notices the mouse's world is never quiet again. She finished her song in a hushed tone, wondering if the man in the obsidian study was still listening to the silence she left behind. The following morning, the sun did not shine on the Moretti estate, it merely glared, reflecting off the sharp edges of the limestone exterior and the polished black SUVs idling in the drive. Imani moved through the corridors with a tray of fresh linens, her footsteps light, yet her mind was heavy with the memory of the night before. The air in the mansion felt different, thicker, as if the walls themselves were watching her with newfound curiosity. She was nearing the servants' staircase when a shadow detached itself from the mahogany paneling of the west wing. It was Marco, the head of security, a man whose face was a map of old scars and whose eyes held the weary, deadened look of someone who had seen too much of the world's underside. He didn't speak at first, he simply stood there, his presence a physical barrier that forced Imani to halt. "You're spending a lot of time in the primary wing, Imani," Marco said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He didn't look at her, he looked past her, scanning the empty hall with a professional paranoia that never slept. "Mrs. Moretti requires constant care, Marco. You know the nurses don't like to stay the night," Imani replied, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden chill in her veins. Marco finally shifted his gaze to her. It wasn't a look of malice, but of a grim, almost fatherly pity. "I've been with the Morettis since Alessandro was a boy. I've seen this house eat people whole, people who thought they were special, people who thought they could find a crack in the ice." He stepped closer, the scent of gun oil and peppermint tea clinging to his suit. "I saw him watching you last night. I saw the way he looked at you when you were singing." Imani felt the blood drain from her face. She tried to move past him, but he placed a heavy, calloused hand on the edge of her tray. "Listen to me, girl," he whispered, his tone dropping to a level of deadly seriousness. "Alessandro Moretti isn't a man, he's a force of nature. He is the sun. And while the sun provides light, it also blinds and incinerates everything that gets too close. You are a soft thing. You are made of song and kindness." He leaned in, his eyes boring into hers. "In this world, those things don't survive. They are used as kindling. If you keep looking at the sun, Imani, you will burn. And there won't be enough of you left for a funeral." He released the tray and stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Imani stood frozen in the hall, the linen suddenly feeling like a shroud. She looked toward the heavy oak doors of Alessandro's study, feeling the heat of that invisible sun radiating through the wood, and for the first time, the warmth of his gaze felt less like a sanctuary and more like a sentence. The clock in the grand hallway chimed midnight, the sound vibrating through the floorboards like a warning Imani chose to ignore. Driven by a restless energy she couldn't name, she retreated to the kitchen, seeking the grounding familiarity of a simple task. She didn't turn on the overhead lights. The silver glow of the moon through the floor-to-ceiling windows was enough to turn the industrial kitchen into a cathedral of brushed steel and shadow. She reached for a kettle, intending to steep some chamomile to quiet her racing heart, when the air in the room shifted. It was a subtle change, a sudden weight that made the hair on her arms stand up. Then, the scent reached her, the deep, earthy aroma of sandalwood mixed with the sharp, clean scent of expensive gin. "The tea helps with the ghosts, but not with the silence," a voice rumbled from the darkness of the breakfast nook. Imani gasped, the copper kettle slipping from her hand. Before it could strike the floor, a large, tattooed hand shot out from the shadows, catching it with terrifying precision. Alessandro stepped into the sliver of moonlight. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark, intricate ink that wound around his forearms like vines. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice missing its usual edge of command. He set the kettle on the counter and stood closer than he ever had before. Imani looked down at his hands, then slowly up to his face. For the first time, she didn't see the boss. She saw the man Marco had warned her about, the sun that could burn. But she also saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, a weariness that mirrored her own. "You're awake late, Mr. Moretti." "I find sleep to be a poor negotiator," he replied, leaning against the cold marble island. He studied her, his gaze heavy and unblinking. "Why do you sing to her, Imani?" "The others, they treat her like she's already gone. They fear her because they fear me." Imani felt the mask of the servant slipping, the yes, sir and no, sir dying in her throat. She met his gaze with a terrifying honesty. "Because she is still here, Alessandro. And because no one should have to face the dark without a song to guide them. Not even a Moretti." The use of his first name hung in the air, a daring bridge across a canyon of status. Alessandro didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step forward, the scent of sandalwood enveloping her. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from the stray curl at her temple, before he pulled back as if remembering he was made of fire and she was made of silk. "You are a dangerous girl," he whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, raw emotion. "You make me remember things I spent 20 years trying to forget." In that kitchen, surrounded by the tools of her labor and the symbols of his power, the silence finally felt soft. For a fleeting moment, they weren't the predator and the prey, they were just two souls caught in the midnight hour, realizing that the light she carried was the only thing capable of casting a shadow as long as his. The peace born in the midnight kitchen was a fragile glass ornament, and outside the reinforced walls of the Moretti estate, the hammers were already swinging. In the smoke-filled backrooms of the city's industrial district, where the air tasted of sulfur and resentment, the balance of power was shifting. The Valenti family, survivors of Alessandro's previous purges, moved like rats in the dark, sensing a change in the wind. They had noticed the subtle cracks in the Moretti monolith, the way the boss's black SUVs lingered longer at the estate, the way his iron focus seemed to drift during meetings that previously ended in blood. Lorenzo Valenti, a man with eyes like oil slicks, leaned over a scarred wooden table covered in grainy, long-lens photographs. They weren't photos of drug shipments or ledger books. They were photos of a girl in a light blue uniform standing by a garden window, and a silhouette in a black suit watching her from the shadows of a balcony. "He's found a heartbeat," Lorenzo whispered, his voice a jagged rasp of delight. "The great Alessandro is finally distracted by a piece of soft flesh." In the world of the Cosa Nostra, a distraction was a death sentence. The word was spreading through the hidden arteries of the city. The king was no longer looking at the chessboard, he was looking at the Maid. The rival families didn't see a romance, they saw a tactical error. To them, Imani wasn't a person, she was a soft spot, a nerve ending exposed outside the armor. If they couldn't break Alessandro's line of soldiers, they would break the thing that made him hesitate. The plan was hatched with the cold, reptilian logic of men who traded in tragedy. They wouldn't strike at the docks or the counting houses. They would strike the heart. They knew the schedule of the deliveries, the rotation of the gate guards, and the exact location of the east wing where the sick woman lay. They understood that to destroy Alessandro Moretti, they didn't need to kill him, they simply needed to extinguish the only light left in his house. As the meeting dispersed, the air in the city grew heavy with the static of an approaching storm. Back at the estate, Imani tucked a fresh sprig of lavender under Catherine's pillow, unaware that her name was being etched onto a bullet. The gathering clouds were no longer metaphorical, the predators had picked up the scent of sandalwood and song, and they were closing in to see if the heartless king would bleed when his only sanctuary was torn away. The storm broke not with thunder, but with the sharp, rhythmic glass shatter of a dozen windows exploding simultaneously. The sound tore through the oppressive quiet of the Moretti estate, followed immediately by the staccato rhythm of suppressed gunfire. In the east wing, the amber light of the sickroom flickered as the power grid was severed, plunging the world into a terrifying, moonlit gray. Imani bolted upright from her chair by the bed, her heart colliding with her ribs. She didn't scream. The years of living under the weight of the Moretti silence had taught her that noise was a luxury of the safe. Across the room, Catherine's eyes flew open, wide with a lucidity born of sheer terror. "They're here," the old woman wheezed, her hand trembling as it searched for Imani's. "I have you," Imani whispered, her voice a steel wire of resolve. She didn't hesitate. She remembered the instructions Marco had growled at her weeks ago, instructions she had prayed she would never need. She scooped Catherine's frail, bird-like frame into her arms, the silk sheets trailing like a shroud. The weight was nothing compared to the crushing pressure of the adrenaline flooding her veins. The hallway was a chaos of shadows and the smell of ozone. From the grand staircase, the shouts of men and the heavy thud of boots grew closer. Imani moved with a desperate, silent grace, slipping behind a heavy velvet tapestry that concealed the entrance to the reinforced safe room, a tomb-like chamber of cold steel hidden within the mahogany walls. She slammed the door shut just as a bullet whistled through the tapestry, splintering the wood where she had stood a second before. Inside the safe room, the silence was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to swallow the sounds of the massacre unfolding outside. Imani lowered Catherine onto the small cot, her own hands finally shaking as she engaged the triple locks. "You have to leave through the service vent, Imani," Catherine urged, her breath hitching. "The panic room has a secondary exit for the staff. If they find us, they only want me. You are just a girl. Go." Imani looked at the heavy steel door, then back at the woman who had become the only soul she cared for in this house of ghosts. She thought of Alessandro's eyes in the kitchen, the way the sun had looked at the mouse. She thought of the song she had sung to guide Catherine through the dark. "No," Imani said, her voice dropping into a low, honeyed tone that brooked no argument. She sat on the floor, leaning her back against the cold metal of the door, and took Catherine's hand. "I told you, no one faces the dark alone. Not tonight." Outside, the muffled sounds of an empire being torn apart vibrated through the steel, but inside, Imani began to hum, a low, steady vibration of defiance against the encroaching shadow. She was no longer just a maid, she was a shield, and she would not budge. The steel door of the safe room groaned, the sound of the heavy bolts disengaging echoing like a series of gunshots in the confined space. Imani didn't move. She remained seated on the floor, her back braced against the metal, her hand still locked firmly around Catherine's. When the door finally swung outward, it didn't reveal the oily gaze of a Valenti assassin, but a vision of absolute, controlled carnage. Alessandro stood in the threshold. He looked like a god of war who had descended into the pits of hell and climbed back out. His white shirt was no longer white, it was a map of crimson sprays and dark, drying smears. A jagged cut wept blood down his cheek, and his knuckles were split, yet his eyes, usually as cold as Antarctic ice, were burning with a frantic, desperate light. He didn't look at his mother first. He looked at Imani. He saw the way she sat in the dust of the reinforced room, her light blue uniform smudged with soot and stained with the copper-scented reality of the night. He saw the bruise forming on her shoulder where she had braced the door, and the way her hair had escaped its neat tie, framing a face that was pale but utterly unyielding. She looked up at him, and for a heartbeat, the only sound in the house was the ragged rhythm of their breathing. "You stayed," Alessandro rasped, his voice cracking for the first time in his adult life. It wasn't a question, it was an admission of awe. He had spent his life surrounded by men who were paid to stay and who fled the moment the bullets outpaced the payroll. He had never seen someone stay simply because it was the right thing to do. "I told you," Imani said, her voice trembling but her spirit visibly intact. "I don't leave people in the dark." Alessandro stepped into the room, the scent of gunpowder and sandalwood following him like a shroud. He dropped to one knee, a posture no capo or king had ever forced from him. He reached out, his blood-stained hand hovering over her face before he tucked a stray curl behind her ear with a tenderness that was more shocking than the violence outside. He looked at his mother, who was watching him with tears in her eyes, and then back at the maid who had guarded her life with nothing but a song and a steel door. In that moment, the wreckage of his estate didn't matter. The war with the Valentis didn't matter. He realized that while his enemies had tried to strike his heart, they had only succeeded in proving that his heart was now inseparable from the woman before him. The heartless king was gone, replaced by a man who realized that grace was the only thing powerful enough to survive the blood. The aftermath of the assault left a silence far more terrifying than the gunfire. As Alessandro stood in the center of the safe room, the scent of spent shell casings and Imani's lavender soap swirled together, a sickening reminder of how close the darkness had come to extinguishing the light. He looked at Imani, still seated on the floor, her fingers entwined with his mother's. To the world, she was a maid, a ghost in a blue uniform, an expendable servant. And that was exactly why she had nearly died. In the cold, calculating logic of the underworld, Imani was a vulnerability precisely because she had no rank. She was a message waiting to be written in blood. Alessandro understood with a sudden, jagged clarity that as long as she wore that apron, she was a target. His protection was a hollow promise if it only extended to the kitchen door. If he kept her as she was, he was merely keeping her in a waiting room for the grave. He could send her away with a suitcase full of cash, but the Valentis were like wolves. Once they had caught the scent of a man's heart, they would hunt it to the ends of the earth. He looked at the wreckage of the hallway, the shattered marble, the splintered mahogany, the bodies of men who had died for his name. Safety in his world was not bought with walls or guards, it was bought with status. It was bought by making someone so vital, so public, and so sacred that to touch them was to invite the wrath of every soldier in the city. A reckless heat began to burn through his veins, a defiance of the very laws he had spent a lifetime enforcing. He had spent years keeping his personal life in a box of stone, hidden and cold. To bring a girl like Imani into the light of his empire was an act of tactical insanity. It would invite scrutiny, judgment, and perhaps even mutiny from the old guard who demanded a suitable match. But as he watched Imani gently wipe a smear of soot from Catherine's forehead, his decision solidified like cooling lead. He would not let her be a shadow any longer. He would not let her safety depend on his ability to hide her. He would give her the only armor that could truly protect her in a city of monsters, his name. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the heavy, cold metal of the family signet ring, the crest of the Moretti bloodline. It was a reckless escalation, a move that would change the trajectory of the city's history, but as he looked at the girl who had stayed when the world fell apart, he knew it was the only way to make her untouchable. The great hall of the Moretti estate smelled of stale smoke and expensive cologne, a scent that usually preceded a funeral. The long, obsidian table was flanked by 10 men, the capos of the Moretti organization, each a king of his own violent territory. They sat in a tense, watchful silence, their faces masks of stone. They had arrived expecting a war council, a strategic breakdown of the retribution they would visit upon the Valenti family for the night's audacity. They had come for blood, for territory, for the cold comfort of a battle plan. The double doors at the head of the room swung open with a heavy, final thud. Alessandro stepped into the light, but he was not the man they had seen yesterday. He had washed away the gore, but the intensity in his gaze was blinding, a radioactive heat that made even the most seasoned killers look away. He didn't take his seat at the head of the table. Instead, he stood, his hand resting on the back of his chair, his presence a gravitational pull that bent the room toward him. The Valentis thought they found a weakness, Alessandro began, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that seemed to emanate from the floorboards. They thought they found a soft spot in this house. They intended to use the shadows to tear us apart from the inside. A murmur of agreement rippled through the capos, a dark anticipation. They waited for the names of the targets, for the orders to mobilize. But Alessandro held up a hand, and the room went back to a vacuum of silence. They were right about one thing, Alessandro continued, his eyes scanning each man with a terrifying, predatory focus. There is a heart to this house. But they were wrong about it being a weakness. He stepped to the side, and for the first time, the men noticed the movement in the doorway behind him. Imani stepped forward. She was no longer in the light blue cotton of a maid, she wore a dress of midnight silk that seemed to drink the light, her face composed and regal despite the shadows of exhaustion beneath her eyes. The capos shifted, confusion and a growing, dangerous ripple of judgment crossing their features. To them, she was a breach of protocol, a servant in a sanctuary of power. Alessandro saw the sneers, the tightening of jaws, the silent mutiny brewing in the eyes of his old guard. He knew they saw her as a liability, a girl who belonged in the kitchens, not the council chambers. He let the tension build until it was a living thing, an invisible lion pacing the room. He was leading them into the heart of the den, not to discuss a war, but to end one by rewriting the laws of their world. He reached into his pocket and produced the heavy gold ring, the family crest catching the chandelier light like a spark of defiance. He was about to show them that the soft thing they despised was now the only thing they were forbidden to touch. The air in the room was thick enough to choke a man, a suffocating blend of shock and brewing violence. Alessandro walked the length of the obsidian table, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, until he stood directly in front of Imani. She stood perfectly still, her chin lifted, her gaze fixed on him with a courage that seemed to drain the power from every armed man in the room. He didn't look at his kapos as he spoke, his world had narrowed to the woman before him. Last night, the Valentis thought they could strike at a servant. Alessandro's voice dropped to a terrifying, resonant bass that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. They thought they could target a girl in a blue dress and call it a victory. They were wrong. They didn't target a maid. They targeted the heart of this family. A sharp, collective intake of breath hissed through the hall. Marco, standing by the door, placed a hand on his holster, his eyes scanning the kapos for the slightest sign of dissent. Alessandro reached out and took Imani's left hand. It was steady, warm, and remarkably small against his scarred, blood-stained palm. From this moment forward, Alessandro declared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling like a decree from a dark god, there is no maid in this house. There is only a Moretti. He lifted the heavy gold signet ring, the ancient crest of his bloodline glinting under the crystal chandeliers. With a solemnity that bordered on the sacred, he slid the ring onto Imani's finger. It was massive, a golden weight that looked like a shackle to the world, but felt like a shield to her. As the metal touched her skin, the declaration was final. This is the Untouchable brand, Alessandro said, finally turning to face his men, his eyes Promethean and deadly. She is the new matriarch of this house. If a single hair on her head is harmed, if a single shadow falls across her path without her consent, I will not just start a war. I will burn this city until there is nothing left but ash and silence. You will protect her as you protect your own lives, or you will answer to me. The silence that followed was absolute. The kapos looked at Imani, seeing no longer the girl who cleaned their spills, but the woman who held the leash of the monster they feared. One by one, starting with Marco, the men inclined their heads in a slow, deep bow of submission. Imani looked down at the ring, then up at Alessandro. The scariest Mafia boss was no longer looking at her with the eyes of a predator, but with a raw, terrifying devotion. In the middle of a den of lions, surrounded by the machinery of death, Imani realized the song had finally ended. She was no longer a ghost in the shadows, she was the light that governed the dark. She was, finally and forever, untouchable.